Red Dead Redemption 2 running on the PS4's hardware shouldn't be possible. It has a 75 square kilometer map with 5 different states filled with countless of details such as landscapes with different types of weather combined with 200 species of animals and 1200 NPCs, all running on a console from 2013, while the game came out in 2018. The PS4 works with 8GB of VRAM budget, which might sound like enough, but keep in mind that it uses a unified memory architecture, meaning that the developers need the game, the graphics and the system itself to share that amount of space. You can see it as having a small desk where you're trying to write notes, draw pictures, build something and keep all your tools on the table. You'd quickly run out of space, right? So the system uses dynamic memory allocation, which is basically prioritizing the things you need and throwing irrelevant things away to bring them back later when needed. That's exactly what the PS4 is doing while it's running a game like Red Dead Redemption 2. Instead of having the full map loaded, Rockstar's used occlusion cooling by only loading what the player can see in real time to save space. The PS4 had a relatively new system for its time, but it had one major flaw. The operating system itself uses about 3GB of memory just to run. That leaves the developers with only around 5GB to work with, and that has to contain textures, 3D models, animations, sound effects, voice lines, weather systems and physics. So how in the world did Rockstar manage to do this? Well, if we look at previous Rockstar games, the optimization tricks used by the Rage engine were pretty easy to notice. The draw distance, which is how far you can see, and the LOD, level of detail transitions, were pretty limited, which resulted in asset pop-ins, where some objects would suddenly appear where you got closer. But Red Dead Redemption 2 tried to do something much better. Rockstar wanted you to be able to travel from one end of the map to the other without any loading screens. But at first it seemed impossible because there simply wasn't enough memory. But you guys know Rockstars, they always find a way. Inside the console, 3 main parts are working non-stop: the CPU, the GPU and the memory, and they all want the same thing: time. Let's say you're riding a horse across the map. The hard drive is trying to pull in new data, which is called data streaming. You could see the hard drive as a warehouse and the disk of the game as the factory. The hard drive scans the disk and receives things such as a tree model. It receives separate pieces of data such as the texture of the tree, the details, shadows and movement. Once that's stored, the disk has to slightly spin in order to give new information such as the ground or sky. That's why the disk has to spin so fast, because the hard drive needs to receive hundreds of pieces of data to load the game. But this is just the first step. The hard drive itself is too slow to store that much information all at once, so it gets sent to the RAM memory. This place is an unorganized mess of raw data, so that's where the CPU comes in, grabbing everything and sorting it all together in order. Then it finally gets sent to the GPU, which is responsible for creating the graphics and pixels to make it appear on screen. So this whole process is constantly happening over and over again, which is why your console always sounds like it's about to take off. But let's take a look at the game, because why does it contain 2 different discs? Well, the game is around 100GB and one Blu-ray disc can only hold 50. The first disc contains the basics like the map and characters, while the second disc contains heavy things such as high quality cutscenes. On the average PS4, the game runs at around 180p and 30 frames per second. And even though that is pretty low, the visuals still look amazing. So how is that possible? Well, to make it feel smoother, they use temporal upsampling, which is basically using motion blur, blending multiple frames together instead of each frame being perfectly sharp. The game calculates how fast objects are moving across the screen and then smears those pixels in the direction of motion. This is often done using motion vector data, allowing the GPU to apply blur to the objects based on how fast they move by. Because the PS4 can only render 30 frames per second, there's a noticeable gap between each frame. The motion vector data fills in that gap, making it appear way smoother than it actually is. A great example of this is when you're riding your horse at full speed. Everything around you becomes somewhat blurry while your character and horse remain sharp. Next to temporal upsampling, they also use environment masking, using fog, haze and lighting to hide distant objects that haven't loaded yet. All of these tricks are used so that the player doesn't notice anything. Now back to memory, because if you've played the game before, you might have noticed that some NPC faces reappear with different clothes. This also applies for animals, even though there are over 200 species. Only a small number are active near you, and those animals get reused too. So by using procedural variation, for the player the world feels alive, while in reality it's one big simulation. But your horse is different. It's incredibly detailed, to the point where you can see its muscles move. This is called environmental fidelity, making a game so realistic that it feels like real life. And the characters in the game played a huge role for doing this. I previously said that the game has over 1200 NPCs, but looking at what these characters are able to do almost makes them real actors. Unlike most games that use motion capture for body and face, Rockstar's went further. They used actors to perform full scenes together. Dialogue, body movement and facial expressions were all captured at the same time. So besides only doing voice lines, the actors actually became the characters. This is why their behavior and body language feels so natural. It's based on real life interactions. As you might have noticed, some characters can fidget, avoid eye contact, lean on objects and react to their surroundings. But that's not even the craziest part. The script of dialogue is estimated to be over 2000 pages, and each interaction has multiple variations. So the things that a character says to you is based on who you are and what you just did. Arthur Morgan, for example, is a character known for doing dirty work, so he can be seen as an outlaw. Dutch van der Linde, on the other hand, is a socially likable character, so he can be seen as a gentleman. Even though they're both criminals, they get treated differently by other NPCs, because each one of them has a memory of your actions. So if you start a fight in town, people will remember it, but if you help someone, they might greet you later. Now, as you might expect, creating all of this was an absolute nightmare. Writing and recording all of those variations of dialogue took multiple years, and with the limits of the disc and the PS4, Rockstars had to decide where to draw the line, because too much realism could actually destroy the game. It had to feel like an adventure, not a boring day in the life of a cowboy from the 1800s. So now that we've seen how much this game contains, now it makes sense why they had to use 2 discs to make everything fit. And I know 8 GB of RAM containing all of that data still sounds impossible. But keep in mind that even when things look unique, a different tree might just be the same model with a rotated position and slightly different texture. And the game does this with every single object you see. But we all know that when something is new, it's not always perfect. Early after release, players would often experience memory issues, where the game would freeze. This just shows how close the game was to pushing the PS4 to its limit. But despite that, the game was very successful. After nearly 8 years of production, the game finally launched in 2018. It became one of the fastest selling games in history, and in 2019 it launched on PC, which made the developers even more money. On the PC version, the game looked a lot better, and due to the I/O scheduling trying to prevent that pop-in effect, the game is able to show each scene in such a perfect way that it all works together. With this type of system optimization and the x68-64 AMD Jaguar architecture, Rockstars proved themselves again, using the software engineering tricks of the Rage engine. With physically based rendering, Rockstars basically showed the console how physics work in the real world, such as lighting on the skin. And this is also known as subsurface scattering, which is what makes characters look alive. Rockstars has a long history of pushing hardware to its limits through these optimization tricks. And if you want to see another technical breakdown, then I'd recommend to watch these videos to see how they did it with GTA. Now, if you enjoyed this technical analysis, then be sure to subscribe to my channel. Now, thanks for watching and see you next time.